Welcome, everyone. My name is Coralie Pledger. I'm the Chief Financial Officer here at the Austin Community Foundation. We want to thank you so much for joining us today to discuss mobilizing impact investments to boost COVID economic recovery. So on the next slide, you will see our agenda for the next hour. We're going to have our welcome and introductions. I'm going to spend just a brief amount of time walking you through our Fund Atx Impact Investing program. We have our panelist, Neeraj Agarwal from MSDF to talk about the data and research in these areas. And we have some wonderful panelists today. So just a couple of housekeeping items. We do have the format today, you're on mute. But if you have questions, if you go to the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, you can click on that. Be sure you hit the select to all panelists button, and you can throw some questions in there if you have some. We should have some time at the end for Q&A, but know that if we don't get to your question, we will reach out directly and make sure we address what you've asked. So we have a great lineup today. Joining us from the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, Program Director Neeraj Agarwal, who is our brilliant friend and all things impact investing for MSDF in Texas and abroad. Selena Pena is the Chief Advancement Officer for Lyft Fund, headquartered in San Antonio, but in over 13 states now. And Andy Posner, who's the CEO of Capital Good Fund. Both Lyft Fund and Capital Good Fund are recent co-investments of both MSDF and ACF. So we're so happy to have them here today for this discussion. So for those of you tuning in, we think many of you are already investors in our Fund Atx program. We couldn't do it without you, so thank you so much for co-investing with us. Others on the call today may just have an interest generally in impact investing. So I want to start today with just, again, a brief overview of our Fund Atx program. We launched in 2015, and this first screen is really just a visual way for us to communicate sort of how we define Fund Atx. The impact investing space is sort of famous or infamous for a lot of jargon and a lot of acronyms. And it's that jargon isn't necessarily used consistently by different people in the space. So typically foundations have operated on each end of this spectrum. So you have investments on one side, philanthropic investments, and then you have grant making or the social impact on the other side. So typically foundations have done conventional institutional type investments in the public markets, and really for financial return only. They have tended not to have any kind of social impact screen. And then those returns are used to make grants and to actually execute on your impact strategies. So at some point, foundations started to sort of re-examine that theory and think about ways that they could take some of those conventional investments and move them sort of down the spectrum towards impact. So maybe you start with some what's called responsible investing or sustainable investing, where you're still looking for a market rate return, but you're doing perhaps some screening that is connected to your values as a funder. And then you move a little bit perhaps farther down the spectrum where you may be sacrificing some market return or financial return, but you're increasing your impact metric. And so for Fund Atx, where we are is in that silo called program-related investments. And that actually is a legal term. It's created by the IRS. And what it really means is that financial return is secondary to impact. So it's really an investment for charitable purpose. So that is squarely where Fund Atx lives for us. And it's really a tool that we partner with our grants for all our social impact work. So as we drill down a little bit more into Fund Atx, the focus, because of our strategic plan, we focus this tool and these investments on affordable housing and improving economic security. And we define that really as access to capital and fair financial products for communities that have been underrepresented in both banking and financial services. We do this on a place-based strategy. So our investments are only in the 5-county area, and they have primarily been low interest concessionary loans to either nonprofits or community development institutions as intermediaries. And so the next slide is a snapshot of our current portfolio. It's about $3 million. So you can see we've got about 9 or 10 different investments in our categories of housing and economic security. Our target return is 2%. And we've been able to turn that money several times. So we have had capital returned plus the 2%, and then we've been able to reinvest again. And again, we launched this fund in 2015, and we've had no losses to date on the portfolio. It's been fantastic. So the majority, I want to point out, of our investees are what are called community development financial institutions. And I want to do a quick shout out. I was in a prior career, I've been in banking, and I literally had no awareness of the CDFI ecosystem. And these organizations are just the workhorses of this missional capital work. There are hundreds of them across the country. They're actually chartered or certified by the U.S. Department of Treasury, but their primary focus and mission is 100% dedicated to delivering community development and access to capital to underrepresented communities. So where we are funders and love putting this money out, we do not have the skill, the expertise, the systems, or the scale to actually deliver that money into the hands of entrepreneurs, small businesses, and individuals. So they are our best friends in the impact investing space. So just wanted to do sort of a quick shout out and awareness of the CDFI ecosystem. And both Capital Good Fund and Lyft Fund, our organizations represented today, are CDFIs. So just from a strategy perspective, as we entered the COVID disaster pandemic back in the spring of 2020, our first attention was drawn to our strongest relief tool, which is our grant making tool. And so Megan Longley, our VP of Community Impact, and her team turned themselves to raising a $7 million fund with our friends at the United Way called Altogether ATX. And that $7 million was pushed out into the community to the nonprofits that are on the front line from around April through September. So sort of after that effort, we really wanted to re-examine our impact investing tool and make sure that we were also focusing our strategy there in the best way that we could, and best supporting the greatest needs of small businesses and individuals in our community. At the same time, increasing the investment that we already had in our local CDFI ecosystem. So it was at that point we realized we needed a lot more research and data, and we reached out to our brilliant friend, Neeraj at MSDF. And luckily, he was gracious enough to allow us to join them on their learning journey. They were also launching a really significant impact investing fund in these same interest areas. And so we partnered with them again, and this great outcome has been the 2 investments that we've been able to make together. So with that, I'm going to turn the microphone to Neeraj, and he's going to present some data and research that he has gathered along the way.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carly. Let me share my screen here. I'll just quickly check that everyone can see that. Yeah, okay. Now, let me see if I can, is that better if it's projected? Okay. Okay, so thanks, Carly. Thanks, Austin Community Foundation for this opportunity. As Carly mentioned, it's been a great partnership with ACF to date. So, yeah, I mean, as Carly kind of indicated, we're coming at small business and personal financing lending relatively new in the US anyway. The foundation has operations in India and South Africa. In India, we've explored both of these verticals for quite some time. But the first time we really started exploring it in the US was at the onset of COVID. And it wasn't a vertical that we naturally leaned into. But where we started was realizing that COVID at that point in time was not just a health crisis, but also an economic crisis. And that economic crisis was manifesting in the form of jobs or lost jobs for a lot of folks. And that's where we started. And we thought, where are the jobs most likely to be at risk? And that's what led us to small business initially and then to personal finance subsequently. So over the next 10 minutes, I want to share with you some high-level data points that we came across. This is all public research that we came across that informed our strategy around small business and personal lending. The first point is, this is a made-up term, but we're actually focusing on smaller businesses. So the SBA defines small businesses as an entity that has fewer than 500 employees. We're actually looking at smaller or even micro businesses. And these are businesses that have less than 100 employees. And what's staggering is that they represent 98% of all businesses in the US and account for 42 million jobs. So coming back to this theme of job creation or job retention, that's why we leaned into small business to start off with. The other staggering stat for us was the fact that in poorer counties in the US, smaller businesses account for the majority of jobs in that county. It's not big business per se. Now, with the onset of COVID, what was happening was that you can see on this chart, this is the share of banks that tightened standards for loans to small businesses. So 70% of loan officers were tightening lending standards to smaller firms, and that is the highest level since the financial crisis. Now that number's thankfully come down a little bit, but the point is that larger companies with more than 500 employees, they also have a workforce or job narrative to them, but we found that they were able to access capital markets for funding. But smaller businesses, even with PPP loans, were struggling to obtain the financing that they required. The revenue, this is a bit of a dated slide now, but at the point that this survey was conducted by an organization called Womply, they found that 42% of smaller businesses were at risk of going out of business. Now, I don't know how that's actually played out, given that we're almost at the end of Q2 21, but that was the survey data that we looked at that point in time to inform our need as well. This, again, is a data statistic, but shows that the business closures and hence the job losses disproportionately affected BIPOC owners, Black, immigrant, and Latinx in particular. Over the past 12 months, like many institutions, we've thought a lot about race and how COVID has disproportionately affected Black and Latinx populations in particular. So this is another overlay to some of the data. Now, the market dynamics are really interesting because we kind of started thinking, well, why is it the fact that, that larger institutions do not serve smaller businesses? And where is the need? This is an interesting study that Harvard Business School did about 4 or 5 years ago, but they found that most smaller businesses actually are seeking loans less than $50,000, 44%. And the reality is that making small dollar loans is expensive. So this is a survey of 6 CDFIs, some of which focus exclusively on small business lending, some of which combine small business lending with other functions. But it shows that the average cost of providing these loans is 35%. So for loans less than $50,000, that's about $15,000 that it costs just to provide that loan, which sounds high in relative terms, but when you break down that $15,000, which we'll do on the next page, you'll see that it's actually fairly reasonable. Now, the reality is that CDFIs charge between 10 to 15% per annum interest. That's if they don't get interest buy-down funds. So what that means is that their cost is 35%, they're charging 10 to 15%. There is a need for them to have philanthropic subsidy. But that also points to why commercial lenders don't necessarily invest in this space, or why there's a gap in that market. So we started thinking, well, why is small business lending so expensive? Number one, the search costs. So finding eligible, qualified, smaller businesses is actually quite challenging. So search cost is one. The transaction costs are also, on an absolute basis, actually not that high, but on a relative basis, it starts to add up. When you look at the cost of diligence, the cost of underwriting, the cost of managing those loans, it easily starts to add up to a double-digit $1,000 figure. And obviously, the costs associated with a $50,000 loan are sometimes similar, or not too much lower than the cost of a larger dollar loan, but the interest revenue is much lower. And finally, a lot of banks, they develop their underwriting criteria for larger businesses. So when they try to apply things like credit or collateral or cash flow to smaller businesses, they end up excluding a lot of smaller businesses. Fintech, we've looked at fintech as well, and there has been a plethora of fintech that's emerged. But what that's done is that it's exacerbated, well, not exacerbated, but it's accelerated a lot of these biases that are already inherent in the lending ecosystem. Fintech lenders are attracting a lot of revenue, and we thought about investing in fintechs as well, but they haven't really tweaked their underwriting criteria a whole lot, and they're still focusing on large loan sizes and relatively higher APRs. Okay, I'm going to skip past that. This is a chart which really maps out how we look at the ecosystem. Basically, anything to the left is where we decided to focus our efforts. So you'll see Lyft Fund there. Capital Good Fund isn't on this slide. They're actually related to personal finance, which I'll touch on in a second. But all these models to the left are the ones that have a very strong social impact orientation. Most of them, except for Kiva, are CDFIs, even Just and Grameen are CDFIs. But as I mentioned, all of them to the left of that line require a philanthropic subsidy to sustain operations, because they are making small dollar loans at a relatively low APR. All the ones to the right, the fintech lenders, the revenue-based lenders, the bank loans, they're commercial models, but they're commercial because they offer higher loan sizes and charge a relatively, even though it's lower APRs than the folks on the left, is still relatively high given the risk profile that they're taking on. And they have tighter underwriting criteria. So that's a small business landscape. I'll touch really quickly on personal lending. So we made a whole bunch of investments, I'll say, from about June to October or November last year in all these entities to the left. Then we kind of started looking at personal lending, and some of the statistics here are even more staggering and shocking, especially given where we live in Texas. Texas has a dubious honor of leading the country in the number of unbanked and underbanked households in the country. So that's a third, almost, I think it's almost just over a third actually, of Texan households are unbanked or underbanked. 9.4% are unbanked. They do not have a bank account. That's in the state of Texas. That's an incredible statistic. Texas also has the second worst payday APRs for payday lenders in the country, 661% APR, which is horrible. There's a bunch of reasons for that. I'm not Texan, so I'm not going to try to posit why those reasons exist, why that APR is so high. But one of the reasons is that there's no legislative caps on payday loans, on total charges for payday loans. In a lot of other states, they've actually imposed maximum APRs, but for Texas, there hasn't been such. There's actually been a proliferation of payday loan branches. If anyone drives around Austin, especially near Mueller, where I live, there's loads of payday loan branches everywhere. So this is going out of control in the country, and especially in Texas. And the worst thing is that Black and Latinx households are the primary consumers of these payday loans. 74% of Texan households are actually that use payday loans are Black and Latinx. And this also disproportionately hits folks with incomes less than $50,000. So this, like I said, is not an area that the foundation has traditionally leaned into. But when we saw the pandemic amplifying some existing inequalities in the lending system, we realized that this is an area that we need to start exploring. Now, like you saw in small business lending, there have been payday lending alternatives, Fintech alternatives that have emerged, in Texas especially. These are lower APRs than payday lenders, but that doesn't make them any more affordable. The APRs still range from 144 to 245%. They still prioritize borrowers with high FICO scores. They've still got inflexible repayment, and they have an impact on credit score. So for the people that we care about, the low-income folks, the communities of color, they're slightly better served by payday alternatives, but it's still expensive for them. Like with small business loans, small dollar lending is just really expensive. And by small dollar lending, I mean less than $10,000. It's really expensive. It requires philanthropic subsidy to be affordable. Now, CFPB, which is a government agency, they estimate that lending can be break-even and sustainable at 36%. Other states have, that's a cap that a couple of other states have introduced. But really, this report from Texas Appleseed, which is an advocacy organization in Texas, talks about the fact that in order for there to be like one of the highest pandemic support functions that agencies, foundations, or other organizations can undertake is to invest in and encourage lower cost loans. So Texas Appleseed actually has informed a lot of our thinking as well. And they highlight some of the data points that I alluded to earlier. So that brings me to, we've invested in a bunch, but the two that we'll hear from today, and I'll let Selena and Andy respectively introduce their organizations, but these are stellar performance in their respective domains. I think what stuck out to us, when we talk about small business lending, we talk about personal lending, there's generally a perception that this is really high risk lending, and therefore the interest rates need to correlate to the level of risk. No doubt it is risky lending, but when you look at the track record of these respective institutions, it's pretty incredible. Lyft Fund has disbursed $360 million to 23,000 small businesses with an average repayment rate of 96%. That's pretty incredible given the profile and the size of loans, profile of folks that they're reaching and the size of loans that they're making. Capital Good Fund similarly has disbursed $12 million in personal loans to 6,000 clients. So the sample size here is pretty significant, and their repayment rate is 95%. And they've made a flying start in Texas as well. So there's some of the data points, both on the macro landscape as it relates to small business and personal lending, but also as it relates to Lyft Fund and Capital Good Fund. Just looking at their track records over the years, it's quite impressive. So with that, I will stop and I'll hand it back to Carolee.
Great, thank you so much, Neeraj. It is pretty shocking data. So I want to turn now to Selena and Andy. I'm going to start with Selena. Selena, if we could first just have you introduce yourself to us, tell us about yourself, tell us about Lyft Fund, and then we'll jump in and drill down a little bit more into the products and the initiative that you've created for COVID recovery for small businesses. But let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Selena Benya, and I'm with Lyft Fund. We are, as Neeraj reflected, a CDFI. We were established in 1994 here in San Antonio, which is where I'm at right now. We are now in 15 states, and our expansion is aligned with our mission of serving underserved entrepreneurs seeking capital. I started at Lyft Fund as a Women's Business Center director, so I actually went firsthand to the front lines, and I loved it. I got to marry advocacy, so you see a lot of Neeraj's data, with serving clients and sharing their stories. From there, I moved into lending and was able to carry a portfolio with a team for about 2.5 years before I moved into operations. That experience only enhances my commitment to the company of serving really those emerging small businesses. At a recent conference, we have a network conference. One of my colleagues termed it the underestimated entrepreneur, not the underserved entrepreneur. And that's really what we do in many ways. And as Niraj reflected on this data, Lyft Fund has positioned itself through that expertise and experience of serving entrepreneurs of color, women, and veterans with our commitment of providing that capital along with transparency and opportunities to grow. Our president and CEO, Janie Barrera, who's our founder, she says we have a horrible business model. We want our best clients to go away. We want to move them into traditional financing. And she says, who else does that? And she's right to a certain extent, right? Some take longer than others, but it is a process in which, obviously, as you saw these numbers in front of you and why you're here today, is to close the inequities, not only that are societal, but they're also systemic and policy driven as well. And so CDFIs were created to close that gap despite policies that potentially leave entrepreneurs of color and emerging small businesses out.
That's awesome, Selena. So talk a little bit about the loan recovery fund that you created around COVID. And I know it has some unique characteristics, both in the type of entities and also the underwriting. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we actually started our journey in recovery loans during Hurricane Katrina and Ike, actually. So when we thought about how do we get money to folks who are in frantic, right? That was our first initial kind of entry into recovery loans. We obviously have evolved and there are more recovery issues that we face both naturally and obviously through COVID. And so in our evolution, one thing that has remained true is helping us understand and defining a product based on where a client or a business owner started in the pandemic scheme, right? So we have those who were obviously established businesses, but we also have those who started right before COVID. And we have those who've actually created businesses because of COVID. And we have products that serve all three buckets, if you will, at this point. So as we started, we were pretty strict that you had to have a business as of February 2019. And that has evolved as the three products that I've mentioned. We also include deferment elements. So this means that while we start with a loan, we have up to 12 months for products that a business owner does not have to pay any of its debt. It's only, it's part of the portfolio, and we stay in touch and engage with them to make sure they're doing well. And if they're having any challenges, we connect them to consultation services, which our team provides. So those are the three buckets as it relates. We also have raised money outside of investments that help us create pools of loan loss reserve, which is one bucket. And also, as Niraj showed you, the cost of capital, we raise grant money to help reduce those costs as well to the client. So that's kind of our suite of elements. I think the most important thing that I hear from folks is, I just need to get an understanding of what are my options based on where I am as a small business owner. And at Lyft Fund, while our mission is to provide credit and support has become a huge part of just helping people navigate what is the right fit for them at this time, especially as PPP is winded down and the EIDL program as well.
Great, thank you, Selena. So Andy, I'm going to turn to you now. Up in Rhode Island, so and coming soon to Texas. If you would introduce yourself, tell us about Capital Good Fund.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Very nice to meet everyone and thrilled to join the conversation. So I'm Andy Posner. I'm the founder and CEO of Capital Good Fund. We're a nonprofit CDFI, which I started in February of 2009 while going to Brown. in Providence, Rhode Island, in response to the last economic crisis, but also in response to my learning about the issue of predatory lending, which Niraj did such a good job of highlighting. Well, certainly the issue in Texas, it's also an issue in Rhode Island and in many other states. So we're pretty unique among CDFIs in that we focus entirely on small dollar personal loans. And in fact, the loans that we do range from $300 all the way up to $50,000. So we have everything from a payday alternative loan of $300 to $1,500 that people use for things like rent, utilities, car repair, technology purchases, paying off payday loans. But we also do loans for immigration expenses. We have an energy efficiency loan program, auto refinance, and some other purposes. And then additional to that, we offer financial and health coaching. As I mentioned, we got started in Rhode Island. Am I breaking up?
You're good.
All right, let me know. Am I breaking up?
Yes, a little bit.
Okay. All right, give me a moment to switch to a different device. Maybe ask Selena a question and I'll get on a different device.
I see how you roll there, Andy.
Yeah, Selena, so
I'll be right back.
Okay,
Sure.
Another question for you. So as the world is reopening, you know, how is that affecting the small businesses that you're dealing with?
So in reflection of what, Niraj, I need to borrow your slides. Let me know if I have to send some gifts or something. In terms of the world as it is economically for small businesses, there's still some uncertainty. And I think it lies on both parties. So not just the small business owner, but also us as lenders. As you know, the federal government just released that second tranche of money, and there will be another tranche of money coming out in the summer as well that's associated with the Biden administration's policies in January. And so there's a sense of a couple of things. One, excitement around markets opening, which we are celebrating across not only Texas, but the US. Concern about a potential fourth wave, or what a fourth wave would look like, even with adaptation. And then folks concerned that the adaptation that they did to survive, how do they change it to thrive, no matter what the condition is? So when we think about, retail, I'm not sure if you've gone to your local store, but when I wanted to get beans shipped to my house from my small provider, they were still not able to do that, right? It took a while for them to figure it out, compared to others that really understood or were already there, pandemic. So the clients we serve are in that second, the being second element. So the question for them is, if I need money, right, how should I be using it so that, first of all, I'm not feeling the debt so much and I'm actually making more money with this debt? And then if something hits, how do I keep on going with that momentum? And then the other crisis, right, is this whole notion of manufacturing and products that, there is a high demand, and globally, everyone is feeling that product crunch. The other day, our small businesses were going to do a t-shirt. They said the manufacturer is backlogged like 2 months because of t-shirt production. That, if you think about logo design and stuff like that, there's a chain, right, that is beyond that small business's control. Or even if the cost goes up so much, would my client come and purchase those from me with such a lag time and a high cost? So they're concerned not only about their operations, but the codependency of other things, mostly products and services. And then how do they use their capital so that they don't feel as much debt, because several are still not at the pre-pandemic well, they may be at the pre-pandemic income, but their costs have gone up, right, as well.
Thank you, Selena. Andy, we've got you back on the backup Wi-Fi.
Sorry about that. Ugh.
No worries. To continue.
So yes, I was mid spiel about Capital Good Fund. So yeah, over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of really exciting growth. For many years, we were just in Rhode Island, then we started expanding into Massachusetts and Florida. Last year, we expanded into Illinois in January of 2020. And then on November 9th, we started lending in Texas. And I should note, we're an online lender. So whenever we're in a state, we can serve folks statewide. About 40% of our clients are Latinx, 25% African-American, 2/3 are female, focus on folks who are low income, no or poor credit. And actually, Niraj, your numbers are a little bit out of date. We just crossed $15 million lent out to 7,400 borrowers with a 94% repayment rate. We're over 40 employees. We've been growing really fast. And I think a lot of the recent growth has been due to the fact that in response to the pandemic, we launched a crisis relief loan, which I imagine we'll talk about in a little bit, but that's what you guys invested in. And we've done over 2,100 of those. So we've really been able to respond to the need in the community. And also, we have been able to offer deferments to all of our clients that needed one. And as a result, our portfolio performed better last year than in prior years. And it is now back to pre-pandemic levels in terms of the active portfolio. So, yeah.
Andy, well, let's go ahead and drill down and talk about your emergency COVID relief product.
Yeah, absolutely. So since day one, we've offered a payday alternative loan that was, as small as $300. Typically, it would only go up to $500, but within 2 weeks of the pandemic becoming a pandemic, we realized that we would need to create a product that was different, that would have some unique characteristics. So we created the crisis relief loan, and it works as follows. So it's $300 to $1,500. The interest rate's just 5%. It has a built-in 3-month deferment period, so no payments for 3 billing cycles, and then 12 monthly payments. Like all of our loans, it's reported to the credit bureaus. So we see an average 75-point FICO score increase. Also in Texas, a borrower will save about $700 in interest and fees compared to a payday loan. And people are using it for the kinds of things you would expect, although a lot more has been for technology purchases, particularly early on. Families needed a tablet so their kids could do schooling from home. But the part that's really innovative about this that I'm really proud of is we faced a problem, which was how do we make loans to people who, by virtue of the pandemic, wouldn't necessarily be able to pass an ability to pay test at the moment they applied, but that pre-pandemic could have passed it. So in order for us to provide capital to people that needed it in an emergency without putting our capital at risk, and in turn yours, or putting our borrowers' credit at risk, we created a grant-funded loan loss reserve. And so for every grant dollar we put into this reserve, we lent out $3 of our own capital. And that meant a couple things. The first one is that as long as our defaults don't exceed 33%, none of our principal is at risk. And we're targeting 16 on this product. Therefore, we were able to make loans to people who couldn't pass the ability to pay test now necessarily, but who still have an active bank account, which is an important part of our underwriting, and who we believe could have afforded the loan before the pandemic and have reason to believe when the economy reopens, we'll be able to pay it. So we were able to take a little more risk. The other thing that we're able to do is, while we don't tell clients this, if a loan's at the point where we normally would write it off, we actually will forgive it. So it'll show up as paid as agreed on their credit report, thereby protecting the client's credit. Because it would be irresponsible to make loans that don't meet our normal criteria and then have a deleterious effect on their credit. So that has been enormously successful. Like I said, we've done 2,100 of these for almost $2 million. So far, we've only had to forgive 6%. So they're performing very well. And the need is evolving in terms of how people are using the loans, but we continue to raise money for it. In fact, we just got $1.3 million from the US Treasury, most of which we're going to allocate for this loan loss reserve.
That's fantastic, Andy. And the Payday data certainly explains why you would see Texas as an opportunity, but tell us why you sort of chose Texas as your expansion state and how you're going to reach new customers here.
Yeah, so in 2016, we did a 50-state analysis because we were saying, okay, we want to dramatically scale. We need to go beyond Rhode Island. Texas was either second or third on the list of states for us. So we looked at the size of the predatory loan industry, the regulatory landscape as it pertains to us and our ability to lend. And then we looked at things like the size of the immigrant market, that being a huge focus of ours, poverty rates, unemployment rates, and that sort of thing. And then we were fortunate to receive funding from JP Morgan specifically to come into the market. We started the process in late 2019. It took longer to get the license than we thought, actually. But I have to say the welcome has been incredible. This has been the fastest expansion we've ever had in a market. And we've already been able to bring on dozens of partners, community partners, funders, investors. And so your infusion is going to allow us to do $100,000 of deployment in Greater Austin. And the way that we reach families is Google AdWords ads, organic Google searches, earned media, word of mouth. And actually, if you Google us, you'll see we have over 330 reviews with a 4.8 rating, which I just love because whoever rates the lender, right? And then we have targeted community partnerships, like with United Way 211 and Catholic Charities and the like.
Mm-hmm. So same question, Selena. Lyft Fund is an established organization in San Antonio, Texas, and in many states, but how do you find your customers? How do you do your outreach to reach all the folks that really need your help?
Yeah, so similar to Andy, using the digital approach, we're pretty consistent and have been for quite a while. Drilling down deeper though, many a times it's banking partners who are unable to help emerging small businesses that know about CDFIs and Lyft Fund. If you think about the proactive, thoughtful person who's putting together a request for funding, maybe they bank at the local bank, right? Or a national bank, and observe that they do need credit, but don't necessarily know those policies. They are ready to be lent to, right? And so our banking partners serve as a great word of mouth, both informally and formally for Lyft Fund. Based on pre-pandemic and even currently, we're seeing anywhere from 60 to 65% of our deals come from our financial institutions. So when you think about a CDFI and that spectrum that Niraj shared with you as it relates to capital, where banks have a relationship, a depository relationship, helping is still innate in the frontliners at a bank to say, I have a solution potentially for you, and it's a CDFI. They probably don't say CDFI, they probably just say Lyft Fund or People Fund or BCL, right? And so there is a connection that allows us to then be able to have an immediate trust because of that referral. So that's one outside of the digital performance. And then, as you all may or may not know, there are ecosystems within multiple cities, including Austin, that are committed to strengthening partnerships and serving small businesses, and particularly women of color and entrepreneurs of color in closing. And we always say the capital gap, but it's also the resource gap, right? So how do you equip, and that's why I love our mission statement at a high level, because it includes support and credit. Because many a times that person who's packaging, we just did a deal for an office purchase for a Latina-owned business, florist. And she actually went to a major financial institution. They couldn't help her, not because she wasn't loan ready, but she just didn't have everything in place financially, meaning her balance sheet. And, you know, what does the P&L look like? And this person has been in business for 15 plus years, right? And so that's an example. and Niraj, to your point about the cost, but also how do you scale this, right? It takes a lot of pieces of us to think about what are some of the unique elements of consistently underestimated entrepreneurs and how do we serve them better, right? Alongside with the unique elements that they need to be successful. And just like Andy, partnerships across the footprint always help. But it's also our responsiveness to our partners and to our clients that actually make the difference too. So our team members make up a great advocacy, a great voice for the company too. Just like Andy, I will say we do report credit, just so you all know, as it relates to some CDFIs don't. And we actually, both Andy and I sit on the Credit Builder Alliance board together. So it's great to see you virtually in Texas, Andy. But that is a huge commitment to our work, is ensuring that we are leveraging someone's trust in us and their trust in themselves to grow themselves financially, and reporting it to the Bureau so that, as my boss says, we lose our best customers.
That's great. Niraj, I want to turn to you for a second. In some sort of earlier conversations we had, you had posed some really good questions around all the stimulus money. And Selena spent some time today talking about getting the right capital to the customers. So I'm going to ask you to pose the question you posed earlier for both Selena and Andy around capital.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure we have all seen the news reports that there's a lot of federal stimulus flowing, whether it's for small businesses. Selena mentioned the PPP loan, which has finished now, but there has been quite a bit of funding in that respect. There's funding for households and so for individuals. So it's certainly a question that I get a lot internally, which is like, hang on, isn't there a lot of federal money out there already? So really, I'm trying to see what Selena and Andy say to this question so I can repackage those responses for internal conversation. But yeah, what are you all seeing on the ground as it relates to the flow of stimulus dollars?
Andy, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. This is a really interesting question because I hope it's come across that for both Selena and I, the best loan is the loan we don't have to make because they were able to get it from a bank, or it turns out they didn't need it, right? So none of us are interested in making loans that aren't necessary. So for example, it's true that there have been multiple rounds of stimulus payments. There's been enhanced unemployment. There have been rental assistance programs. So you may very well ask, well, why do people also need a crisis loan? And there are a couple of answers to that. One is that when you just look at the scale of the economic devastation, those have prevented complete financial disaster and potentially a Great Depression. Mm-hmm. But families are still struggling. Food insecurity is up. Evictions are going to start ticking up again. We view our loan as being a critical part of the ecosystem of supports that have been out there. Additionally, not everyone is eligible for that funding. Perhaps they didn't have a bank account and they moved and they never got the money. There's been a lot of unclaimed stimulus money. And then also, depending on your immigration status, you might not have qualified for funding. Also, states have received a lot of money to set up things like rental relief programs. And I know in Rhode Island, the state allocated $100 million for rent relief. So far, they've actually paid out 5% of that. Mm-hmm. So while in theory, all these families should be getting rental relief, the money is not flowing and it's not flowing fast enough. So there's a timing issue as well. And then there's flexibility. So some programs can only be used for this purpose, but maybe not that purpose. And our loan can be broadly used across the spectrum.
Yeah, just expanding on Andy's, there's the non-flexibility of federal funds, right? And I think there's also, when we hear about the money coming down, you have states, and while I'm a born, raised Texan, we have some challenging issues in our politics that allows for demonstrated support as it relates to affordable housing and rental assistance. So the cities in Texas spent their money, and Andy, to your point, the rigor around accessing rental assistance. If you have not gone to the City of Austin's website or the city of Pflugerville's website, you can see the amount of documentation that is needed in order for someone to get assistance. And I don't say that as, it is to help ensure that the money is going to the right person. But at the same time, when you are in crisis, right? When you are now, oh, what is the next step for me? Because I'm going to get kicked out. You are in reactive mode. And you can transfer that over to small businesses as it relates to PPP and EIDL as well, as it relates to, I sat with many clients going through their tax returns and them crying because, the way they submitted their taxes would not allow them to access money for PPP or EIDL. There's this notion or this old, saying that, you don't want to pay taxes as a small business owner, right? So we're going to make sure our taxes are done so that we don't have to do that. Well, crisis pandemic hit. And look what, as it relates to income and profits, actually not being as strong as they should be in order to draw down money at the PPP and EIDL loan level. So I think it's a mix of a whole bunch of stuff that happens really quickly. In a reactive state as disasters are, in front of us. And when we think about federal money, cities have been a tremendous asset to both the household and to the small business. And as us on these calls, it is incumbent upon us to make sure those policymakers remember that. And so we are actually going through current cycles across Texas. City budgets are usually in September. County budgets are in September as well. Advocating for resources of the new federal money towards these, elements of creating a stronger city and county are critical. And you can bet that Lyft Fund, along with several of our other partners, are ensuring that we are trying to make sure, and it doesn't have to be us. It's not about us. It's about making sure resources get allocated, Niraj, to your question, so that it's not just in one bucket, but that it's hopefully in multiple buckets that keep neighborhoods solid, and not just the housing stock, but also that small commercial space, right, as well, so that we don't, recede into an even, deeper depression as it relates to the work.
So based on the fact that both your organizations have really leaned into this pandemic and the crisis, are you seeing improvements for your customers and the people you're serving? I know we're in the middle of it still, but we'd love to hear some great stories.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been really interesting. The types of applications that we're getting now and the stories we're hearing from clients indicate that, yes, the economy is starting to reopen, people are starting to get back to work. Clients are starting to come and pay off their loans, see their increase in FICO score of 75 points. I'm worried about what's going to happen when states pull the enhanced unemployment and moratoria on evictions and various debt payments. It's not like people go back to work and they're suddenly whole again. They've been putting off elective procedures and doctor's visits and all sorts of expenses. So I think this is going to be a crunch time, and it's going to be really important that we continue to provide liquidity to families to make sure that things don't come to a head and then a bunch of families find themselves in crisis. So it's sort of a fraught moment because I think people are starting to want to assume that the crisis is over, and it's not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right on point. And as we navigate, the census happened during the pandemic. It closed out. And when we did the work around the census, it was a lot of effort to make sure that we had all of the demographics and counts done, and now the layers of poverty and information as it relates to CDBG and other elements get put into place. As it relates to our customer base, I would say it's a mixed bag. We, just like Andy, have done significant work in our portfolio to ensure success to our clients. That means that we need to stay flexible, is what that tells me. It also tells me that as a leader within this work, You know, Andy, your reflection on a loan loss reserve allows us to continue that flexibility outside of the capital, so that we can go a little bit deeper or take that little kind of borderline risk that could potentially close the gap, and move people and their families and their businesses into success. There are, like I just mentioned, this one deal because I was on the committee, $100,000 loan, which is usually higher, but it's an asset-based purchase, which we're super excited about for this florist, Latina. She had been trying for a year and a half. And so what this tells me that we just were able to navigate this is that our credit box is opening as a company, and that's exciting that we're going to be able to help more people. At the same time, managing the servicing is going to be critical for us to continue to open that credit box as well.
Great. So we're approaching the end of our hour together. I just want to close with one last question. So what lessons have you learned sort of during this pandemic that might shape or change the way you do business in the future or create different products and initiatives?
I think two things. One is we had never structured a small dollar loan with that kind of grant funded loan loss reserve approach. And moving forward, we're going to do the same thing for these loans, but rather than a 1 to 3, we're going to do more like a 1 to 6 or 1 to 8 leverage because it is grant intensive. But it's a beautiful way to balance sustainability with protecting our clients, protecting our portfolio. The second thing is, while I knew that public policy was important and we haven't been disengaged, pandemic has just shown, it's revealed all the different structural inequities we have. So Capital Good Fund has gotten a lot more engaged on local, state, and federal issues related to predatory lending, wages, voting rights, and that sort of thing, because you can't lend your way out of the crisis that we're in. And so we want to be more holistic in how we fulfill our mission. Well
said, Andy. In terms of Lyft Fund, I just got goosebumps. Good job. In terms of the work, what we learned is that Lyft Fund can have a spigot turned on and perform like no tomorrow. We did the most lending, both on the lending and the small business grants in record time to serve and to alleviate, just this uncertainty to so many. And so we as a company are actually doing a process improvement planning element that includes our frontliners. It's a huge process that we are committed to. So that, that little chart that Niraj showed you is that we figure out what do we take out so that the client value experience is not just about, that it reduces cost, right? But that we are still doing our work and we're doing it better. And we prove that with such a quick shift during COVID that it has required us to ask ourselves, how did we do this? And can we continue to do it? And scale. So while when I first started at Lyft Fund, my president and CEO, she would say on my graveyard, her little tombstone would say, micro lending self-sufficiency. I'm like, that's very human. And she's like, but it is, right? To prove a model in the US is very difficult. And micro lending is not a proven model in the US. And so it's still our North Star in many ways, not because of us as a company, but to serve more folks and close the gap, which is what we did during COVID.
Well, thank you all so much. Neeraj, we are forever grateful to you for your partnership. And Andy and Selena, we are really honored to be investors in your work. So thank you all for attending today. We encourage you to visit our website if you want to find more about Fund ATX. We will be recording this webinar and we'll post it. Reach out to us at any time and we're happy to help. Thank you so much and take care.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you.